Right. The Torah is not a history book, history textbook. Therefore, many of the occurrences that it doesn't even say when exactly it occurred. It says sometimes something happened to Abraham, something happened to Isaac, Jacob. God said something to Moses. It doesn't usually it doesn't tell us an exact date when it took place. The reason being because it's not here to record history. Torah, like its name, means instruction, means a lesson. It's here to teach us what to do in this world. Yes, it tells us where we come from, because that gives us a better appreciation for our mission, and it gives us a better understanding of our mission. But it doesn't just list things, just stories, because they happened. That's why there's many stories that are not listed, because if it's not a story that is applicable and is necessary for the generations to come, it won't mention it. So even though this is a true rule usually, and most times the Torah doesn't tell us when a specific episode occurred, there are times when the Torah, for whatever reason, does feel it's necessary to tell us when something took place. And it does give us an exact time, or date, more like an exact date when something happened. In this week's parsha, which is Parshat Bhaaloscha, which means the literal translation of the word is when you ignite, when you bring up, when you ignite the fire. The beginning of the parsha speaks about lighting the fire of the menorah in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. So in this week's parsha, Parshat Bhaaloscha, the Torah records an episode that took place in the beginning of the second year after the Exodus. The anniversary, the first year. So meaning the beginning of the second year after the Exodus. The Exodus happened in the Hebrew month of Nisan, the 15th day of Nisan, the Hebrew month of Nisan. So the Torah tells us what took place exactly a year later. Now, when the Jews left Egypt, Hashem instructed them to bring the Pesach, the Passover offering, the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. And he told them exactly how to do it. So now, a year later, just under a year later, Hashem, in the beginning of Nisan, the beginning of that month, Hashem tells them, oh, this year I want you again to bring that offering. Again, to bring the offering, the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, similar to what you did the last year, right before you left Egypt. Okay, so the Torah tells us in the second year, the first month of the second year, Hashem spoke to Moshe and told him the Jews should make the Pesach and the Passover offering, should celebrate Passover and bring the Passover offering in its designated time. In the 15th day of the 14th day of the month, they should bring the offering the day before Passover, and they should keep this ritual as they did last year. Okay, nothing too odd, nothing stands out, seemingly very typical. What's interesting is this is in chapter 9 of the book of Bamidbar, the fourth book, the book that we're learning now, that we're studying now. The weekly Torah versions are from. The beginning of the book, the first chapter, speaks about the counting of the Jews, which is something that we spoke about 2 weeks ago. Now, the counting of the Jews took place the second month, in the beginning of the second month, the Hebrew month of Iyar. So why the beginning of the book speaks about something that took place a later date, that took place on the during the second month of the same year, of the second year of leaving Egypt. And a few chapters later, the Torah goes back and tells us what happened on the first day of what happened on the first month of that year. Seemingly, it's out of order. The sequence of events were the opposite. Now, not always does Torah feel a need, like we said earlier, not always does Torah find the need to tell us the date why something took place. But once it is telling us the date, so seemingly it should tell us what happened in order. Why is it telling us out of order? Right, so that's the question, a question that arises as soon as you read it, but just by reading the simple words of this week's Torah portion that says that is telling us an episode that took place the first month, the month of Nisan, while in the beginning of the book a few chapters ago spoke about the second month. So why is it out of order?
What?
Yeah.
No, continue.
Okay. All right. So, like we did in the past classes, we'll take a look at what some of the commentaries say. So I'll share my screen. All right. I'll also share it on the group, on the chat. So do that in just a second. Second. All right. So Rashi discusses this problem. So the first source on the page. The events related in this chapter occurred in the first month of that year, while the events of the first chapters of this book, the book of Numbers, the book that we're studying now, occurred in the second month. This teaches us that the Torah does not necessarily follow a chronological order. Sometimes, even when the Torah tells us exactly when something happened, so seemingly the Torah wants us to know when it happened for whatever reason, but still the Torah doesn't necessarily put things in order. And the reason being because it's not a history book. If it was a history book, so then everything should be in order of the events, in the order of when the events took place. But since it's not a history book, so therefore the Torah, for whatever reason, based on the message that it's trying to bring across, would organize the stories and episodes in accordance with the message that it's trying to give over. So now, okay, that just explains that the Torah is able to change the order. But why indeed does not the book of Numbers open with this chapter? Okay, the Torah doesn't always follow the order of the sequence of events. Okay, but why does it change the book? So Rashi continues, he explains, because it is an embarrassment for the Jewish people, for in the 40 years that the Jewish people were in the desert, this was the only Passover offering that they brought. So here we see that Rashi picks up on the problem that the book is out of order. A story that happened on the first month of that year is recorded much later after something that happened after something that happened the second month of that year. And he explains the reason is because there will be some sort of embarrassment for the Jews if it would start with the episode of the story of the second Passover. The first thing that we have to clarify here is that even though, okay, so seemingly a person could ask, if this episode is an embarrassing episode, and therefore you don't want to start the book with it, so maybe then don't bring it at all. I'm saying, if in the end of the day you want to admit it, so then admit it. So obviously this means that we're not looking to omit it. We're just choosing what to begin with. When Hashem decided what to start the Torah with, what to start each book with, he wanted to start it with something positive, with something that has a good connotation, not something that has a negative connotation. It's not a question whether to bring the story and not to bring the story. Rather, the question is, should we start with this story or start with something else? Counting the Jews, like we spoke about a few weeks ago, is something that is a very positive idea. The message of counting, how every person counts and every person is important, no matter who he is, and every individual, we need every single individual to make up the whole Jewish people, to make up the whole nation. So that's something very positive. So that's why the Torah started with that idea of counting. And the Torah did not want to start with this story, even though on the calendar, according to the timeline, this story took place earlier. It doesn't want to start with this story because this story is an embarrassment. Okay. So it's really a question of what to start with. And we said we're pushing it off a little bit later in the book, not to begin the book with something that's an embarrassment, something that's not positive. Okay. What exactly is the embarrassment? That's what we want to focus on for the next while. The way the written Torah is set up, there are three sections. There's the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings. So the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the timeline of the 5 books of Moses is until the Jews enter, the passing of Moshe, which is until the Jews entered the land of Israel. The prophets begin right after the Jews entered the land of Israel. Yehoshua, which is the first one of the prophets, he begins right after Moshe's passing, when the Jews entered the land of Israel. There are 3 times where the idea of the Passover sacrifice is mentioned in the 5 books of Moses and the book of Yehoshua. The first time is the first Passover that took place when the Jews left Egypt and they brought the offering before they left. The second time is in this week's parsha, this week's Torah portion, when it speaks about the Passover that Hashem specifically commanded the Jews to keep the second year of after leaving Egypt. The next time it's recorded is 40 years later, when the Jews entered the land of Israel. There's a whole chapter in the book of Yehoshua where the Torah tells us exactly that the whole process, how the Jews made a Passover. So there's 38 or 39 years in between the second Passover, which is what we're speaking about in this week's parsha, and the next Passover, which is 40 years later. Why didn't they sacrifice the Passover sacrifice? Why didn't they, which is the proper way of keeping Passover when you're able to, those 40 years? And based on the reason why they didn't do it, that's going to somehow tie into what exactly the embarrassment is here. there are most mitzvos, most commandments are not bound by any place. You could keep it whether you live in Israel, whether you live in America, whether you live in Europe. Kosher has nothing to do with where you live. Most commandments have nothing to do with where you live. There are certain commandments which have to do with where you live. That specifically when you live in the land of Israel, that's when you are commanded in those commandments. Primarily commandments that have to do with agriculture, that have to do with the land. The commandments that have to do with the produce of the land, usually most of them, if not all of them, are bound to the land of Israel. However, there are a few other commandments that are also limited to being in the land of Israel. And perhaps Passover, the Passover sacrifice, not keeping the holiday of Passover, but bringing the Passover sacrifice is also bound and limited to the land of Israel. Let's take a look at a verse which appears earlier in the Torah, in Exodus, in the second book of the Torah, where Hashem says the following. Share my screen. The second source says, and when you enter the land that God will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this service. This service referring to the Passover sacrifice. That portion, that chapter speaking about Passover and the Passover sacrifice. So the simple meaning of this verse is implying that you only have to keep you only have to keep or have to bring the Passover sacrifices when you enter the land of Israel. If that's the case, we understand why the Jews didn't bring the Passover sacrifice for 38 years, because they weren't in the land of Israel. So since the rule that the way God commanded them was when you're in the land of Israel, you should bring the Passover sacrifice, meaning this is the first year right before the Jews left Egypt. So Hashem says, bring the Passover sacrifice this year. And then the next time you should bring it is when you enter the land of Israel. When are they going to enter the land of Israel? At that point, we don't know. They could go directly. Then they'll be there within a few months, well before the next year. They could wander in the desert for 40 years, which is something that actually ended up happening. And then they won't bring it for 39 years in between the first Passover and entering the land of Israel. So now, if that's the case, what's the embarrassment in the fact that the Jews did not bring the Passover sacrifice for all the years they're wandering in the desert? Again, we said the reason why the Torah did not begin with the story of the second Passover, because that Passover Hashem said, true, when you're not in the land of Israel, you don't have to bring the Passover sacrifice, but this year I want you to. This is an exception to the rule. This year I want you to bring the sacrifice, and therefore this year do it even though you're not in the land of Israel. Okay, so then the next year, which is not an exception to the rule, there's no reason for them to think that they should bring the sacrifice, and the fourth year and the fifth year and so on. So then there's no embarrassment in the fact that they didn't bring it for 40 years, because they were not supposed to bring it for 40 years. They were only supposed to bring it after entering the land of Israel. And when Hashem tells them specifically, this year is an exception, right? So according to this, we have to understand what exactly is the embarrassment here. Okay, so just to recap where we're holding, we opened up the class with a question: why does the Torah list this episode in this week's Torah portion, which happened the second month of the second year of leaving Egypt. After the Torah spoke about the first month, after the Torah spoke about, why does the Torah start what happened the first month of that year, after the Torah already accounted what happened the second month of that year? And we brought that from Rashi because in this episode there's a hidden embarrassment. There's something not so pleasant here. Why? Because this is the second year, and we find that the Jews brought the Passover offerings, but we don't find that they brought it the other 40 years. The next time we find that they brought it is in the opening of the book of Yeshua, 39 years later. So that's an embarrassment that they didn't keep that mitzvah, they didn't keep that commandment properly. Now we're asking, if that's the case, what's the embarrassment? Now we're asking that seemingly the reason why they didn't bring it those 40 years is because they did not need to bring it those 40 years. They were not obligated to bring it those 40 years. So if that's true, then there is no embarrassment, because the reason why they brought it this year is because there's an exception to the rule. But all the other years they followed the rule not to bring it until they come into the land of Israel. So that's what we have to understand. What exactly is an embarrassment here? What's the embarrassment? What's the embarrassment with the fact that they did not bring the Passover offering those years that they were wandering in the desert? Everything clear until now? Okay. So to explain this, we would move on to another episode that the Torah records that happened on this second Passover. So God commanded Moshe, bring in the first month of the second year of leaving Egypt, bring the Passover offering in its correct time. Okay, all good. And it says the Jews did that. They brought the Passover offering, and they followed the command. They fulfilled the command, the mitzvah. Then there's a small group of people that were impure, ritually impure, because there's ritually impure when the second Passover came around. Now the law is, in order to partake in an offering, the person has to be pure, meaning if someone comes in contact, one of the ways, for example, of being impure is if someone comes in contact with someone with a dead body. So then he has to go to a mikvah, to a ritual bathhouse, and cleanse himself to get back that quote unquote pure status. So this is all obviously halachic terms. It's not as someone touches or partakes in a funeral, you could clean your hands after and nothing's going to happen. But this is obviously this is all a ritual impurity and purity. So these people they were impure. Why? There's different opinions. Some say because Joseph, who was a leader in Egypt, a Jewish leader, before he passed away, he tells his brothers and the Jews around that, I know you guys are going to be slaves here for many years, and eventually Hashem is going to take you out of Egypt. Make sure my bones go with you, that I'm buried in Israel, not in Egypt. So there had to be people carrying that coffin. So they were carrying the coffin of Joseph. That's one opinion. Another opinion is that they were the ones that took care of Nadav and Avihu, which passed away in the beginning of that month. So they took care of them, they buried them, and therefore they're impure. Whatever the case is, they were impure. There were people that were impure. They came to Moshe and they said, why should we be left out? How come the whole community, everyone is taking part of this Passover offering and celebrating Passover the way it's supposed to celebrate? Why are we missing out? True, we're not obligated because we're impure, and therefore we cannot partake in it. But we still don't want to miss out. So Moshe said, that's a good argument. I'm going to ask Hashem. Hashem communicates to him, yes, these people are right. Let's make a second Passover. A month after the first Passover, there is a second Passover, meaning for those that were not able to partake in the first Passover, either because they are impure or because they were far away. You have to be in Jerusalem to bring the Passover offering, because that's where the Holy Temple is, and that's the only place that we bring offerings. So if someone was distant, he wasn't there, he was far away, so he could come a month later and fix and make up what he missed. Okay, that's the story. That's the story of the second Passover, that people missed out for whatever reason the first Passover because they're impure, and therefore they felt that they were doing a positive thing. They're bringing Joseph's coffin. Why should they miss out? So true, they're not obligated, but they felt they didn't want to miss out. And Hashem said, they're right, let's make a second Passover. And until this day, we commemorate a second Passover. It's not close to as big of a deal as the first Passover, as much less attention is drawn to the second Passover. It's not a week holiday. The Passover, the regular Passover is a week, but many people commemorate it by eating a little bit of matzah that day. It doesn't have the same status as the first Passover because it's only for the minority that was not able to make to make it to the first Passover, and they have to make up on the second Passover. But it's definitely a day on the calendar. Okay. What can we learn from this story? What can we see from this story? What we see from this is something very powerful. Sometimes there could be something that we're not commanded to do. These people were exempt from from bringing the Passover offering because they were impure. They did not need to bring it. And Hashem never said, oh, if you can't bring it the first one, bring this, let's make it up a month later. No, he never said that. If you can't bring it, you can't bring it. You'll bring it next year, hopefully. But they did not suffice with that. They said, no, we want to bring it. We don't want to miss out on this mitzvah. We want to keep this commandment. And even though we don't need to, we're exempt from it, but we still want to do it. And what happened? Hashem heeded their plea, and he gave in to them and said, yes, you would have the merit and you would have the opportunity to make it up a second time. So now, let's think for a moment. Let's go back to our story. The story of the 38 years of wandering in the desert. Those 38 years, they did not need to bring a Passover offering. Why not? Because they were exempt from it. Hashem said, you only have to bring a Passover offering when you enter the land of Israel. All the times when you're in transit, when you're wandering in the desert, you don't have to bring a Passover offering. Okay, so now there's two approaches to this, when someone hears this, that they don't have to bring the Passover offering. One way is, great, sure we won't. We don't have to, we won't. We'll do what we are asked to do, what we're commanded to do. We won't do what we weren't commanded to do. And that's it. Which is actually exactly what happened. They did not bring the Passover offering for 38 years. But then there is another approach. An approach of, why should we miss out? Sure, we don't need to bring the Passover offering these years, but let's ask and let's plea and let's try to work it out that we should be able to bring it these years. Similar to what that minority, those few people that were impure that Passover, they were able to accomplish that. Hashem said, yes, let's make a second Passover where people can make up what they missed. So the Jews also, wandering in the desert, should have said, they should have learned from that episode, and they should have asked Hashem, please, let us bring the Passover even though we didn't enter the land of Israel yet. And just like that time Hashem listened, maybe he'll also listen this time. To say this a little differently, there are many mitzvahs, like we spoke earlier, there are many commandments that are bound and limited to the land of Israel. But most of those commandments are commandments that have to do with the land. So those commandments are understandably that we're not obligated to do those commandments outside of Israel because they're like limited to the land. Bringing the offering is not really limited to the land of Israel. It's limited to having a temple or a tabernacle, the Mishkan. So since they had a place to bring the offering, they had the Mishkan, they were bringing offerings. So they should have said, listen, this commandment is a little different than the other commandments that are bound to Israel, bound to entering the land of Israel. So maybe you could sort of let us bring the Passover offering, let us fulfill this mitzvah, this important mitzvah, even in these 38 years. However, they did not do that. They did not learn from that group of people that were able to accomplish, to rectify, and to that through their asking and through their requesting, they were able to achieve a second Passover. The Jews as a nation did not learn from those people. Rather, they let it go. And for 38 years, they didn't bring the Passover. And the next time the Passover offering is we have in the Torah, the account of the Passover offering being brought is when the Jews entered the land of Israel in the beginning of the book of Yeshua. Now that is the embarrassment. That is something which is not so positive. Because if they really appreciated the commandment and they saw that people that are exempt from certain commandments are able to make up for the commandment, even able to get a second chance, even though they weren't obligated in it. So they should have saw and maybe ask Hashem to work it out also this time to get a second chance and for the next 38 years to bring the Passover on its right time. The fact that they didn't do that, that's already something embarrassing. So this would answer the question we asked, what's the embarrassment? They didn't need to bring it those 38 years. It says clearly in Exodus that the Jews only have to bring it when they end of Israel. So now we're answering just like in a similar episode. Just like in a similar episode, the Jews are able to accomplish, to make up for what they missed. So also here, the Jews should have asked Hashem to let them bring the Passover offering in those 38 years that they wandered in the desert. From the fact they didn't do it, that's an embarrassment. And that's why the Torah doesn't want to open up the book of Bamidbar with this story, even though according to the timeline, this story should be in the beginning of the book, because it's not such a positive story, and the Torah wants to open up the book and to start with something which is positive and has a good connotation. Okay, is this clear? Any questions? All right, so we'll move on. One may ask that, okay, the Jews as a whole did not feel...
I do have a question,
Sure.
Rabbi.
Sure.
I wanted to know, you said that the Korban Pesach is supposed to be brought in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
But when they got into Israel, they didn't have Jerusalem. So when were they going to bring the Korban Pesach? Only after King David conquers Jerusalem?
That is a very good question. So before King David conquered Jerusalem, there was a Mishkan set up in the city of Shiloh. So the Passover offering is only brought either in the tabernacle that wandered with the Jews in the desert, or with the tabernacle that was erected temporarily in Shiloh and other places. So yeah, they weren't able to bring it in Jerusalem.
Okay.
They brought in the Mishkan once King David conquered Jerusalem, and once the temple was built, then that is the permanent place. Hashem said, "This is my permanent place," and then there is no such thing of wandering tabernacles. There is no such thing of bringing offerings in private places. That was only a thing until Jerusalem was built. Once Jerusalem was built, then that came into the permanent dwelling place, the permanent place to serve Hashem and bring sacrifices. And we can't bring it anywhere else. And therefore, someone who's not in Jerusalem, who's distant from Jerusalem, would not be able to bring the sacrifice, and he will have a second chance to bring it on the second Passover, which is a month later.
How long was it temporarily in Shiloh?
Okay, thank you.
So that's a good question. I think, I'm not 100% sure.
It wasn't in fabric. They built it out of bricks. It was about 600 years, I thought, or
Correct.
469 or something.
600 years?
Okay. There are two. There was actually one in the city Ai, and one in Shiloh. I don't remember exactly offhand how many years there were in each. So I can answer that.
I thought I never had extra stuff.
It's funny because often with the Botei Midrashim, everybody says,
Hello?
20,
Rabbi-
but nobody says anything about the Mishkan until then.
Right. Well, it is spoken about. Rashi speaks about it a few times in the Chumash. It's brought up and it comes up every once in a while. What exactly the status of those Mishkans were, if it had the complete status of the temple or did not have a complete status. But even those tabernacles, even though they were built out of bricks, but it still was temporarily in its status of its halachic status.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yes. I thought that when they first came to the land of Israel, I know that Shiloh was mentioned, but I thought that they initially made the capital in Hebron before Jerusalem was conquered. So that wouldn't they have initially had a Mishkan in Hebron?
I don't know. I think the two places were Ai and Shiloh.
No, it's also
Where?
Yeah.
It's only said that David ruled in Hebron until he conquered Jerusalem. But there was no Mishkan in Hebron.
Oh, okay, thanks.
All right. Actually, we could check up. All right. So now based on, okay, maybe someone could ask, okay, the Jews didn't feel a need to ask and request for to have the chance to bring the Passover offering those 38 years that they were wandering. What about Moshe? Moses, his brother Aaron, the elders, the righteous people, the leaders, they were righteous people. They obviously wanted to fulfill every commandment to the utmost and in the most complete way. So why didn't Moshe, by his own initiative, ask Hashem to grant the Jews a chance of bringing the Passover offering those 38 years? Why did Moshe stay quiet? We can maybe say, okay, the community as a whole, the majority didn't feel a need and they just didn't have that spiritual connection. They weren't so righteous, and they didn't feel like they're just they did do okay. We're not commanded, we won't do it. But Moshe, he was a really righteous person. He was a very special. He was very special. He obviously wanted to complete and fulfill every commandment to the utmost. And we even see that when Hashem said you can't enter the land of Israel, Moshe requested to go to the land of Israel. And he said because he wants to fulfill those commandments that you can only do in the land of Israel. So why didn't he come and say here, Hashem, please let us be able to do the mitzvah, the Passover offering for these 38 years? So here, the Rebbe says something very interesting, almost a typical explanation for the style of the Rebbe. It sounds like this. A leader's first and main thing he has to put the people before himself. Anyone has a communal job, position. Always he says that he's accepting upon himself this position to take care of the community, to take care of the nation. So a leader, especially a leader like Moshe, which is an example and was the perfect leader. So the first thing before his own personal needs, he put the people. He put the people before himself. Their needs before his needs. So now, what would happen if Moshe would ask Hashem, please let us bring the Passover sacrifice for these 38 years. And Hashem would grant his request, would say, yes, they could bring it those 38 years. Then the embarrassment for the Jewish people would be much greater. Now that no one asked, okay, maybe Hashem won't say yes. He'll say, no, this is what I decided. This is the way I set up the commandments, that you should bring the Passover sacrifice only in the land of Israel and when I tell you. So the first 2 years when I told you, and then when you enter the land of Israel, these 38 years, I don't want you to bring the Passover sacrifice. True, I gave certain people a second chance, but that was only to make up for something they missed. The second year, when they're supposed to bring it, they weren't able to make up something they missed. The coming years, you're not missing anything. You're not obligated. So Hashem is not good. Maybe Hashem say, no, I don't want to grant your request, which may very well be. So maybe that's why the Jews didn't ask, because they saw this minority, this group, that the request was granted. That's because they're asking to make up. They're asking to fulfill something they missed. But here, where we don't even have the obligation, so we don't need to fulfill something we missed. Therefore, Hashem is probably not to grant our request, and therefore we're not going to ask. True, we want, but we see a very big distinction between our request and their request. So we're not going to learn from them what to do. So an embarrassment there is, because they should have asked. But we can't say it's a complete embarrassment, because who said the request will be granted? And maybe they thought that it's very different. This request is a different request, is very different, like we just explained. If Moshe would go ahead and ask, and Hashem would grant his request, then we'll see black and white. They were interested, they were not interested, he was interested. It didn't bother them the fact they didn't bring the offering for 38 years. That's why they didn't request. It did bother him. So then the embarrassment and the disgrace would be much clearer. So, true, Moshe wanted to bring the sacrifice those 38 years. But he knew that if he requests from it, and the Jews didn't request for it, even if Hashem would grant the request, that would bring an embarrassment. So that would basically mean putting his needs and desires before the people's needs, protecting the image of the people and protecting that they shouldn't be. In other words, until he asks and until it's granted, we don't know what would happen, and therefore it's sort of unknown. So there's no clear disgrace. There's no clear embarrassment. So to protect the people, he put aside his needs and his desires. And he didn't request to offer the Passover in those 38 years. So that's an explanation for this question that someone might have. True, it's an embarrassment the Jews didn't want to, but why didn't Moshe ask? Why didn't the elders, the leaders, the righteous people that were examples for the people? So the answer is because they didn't want to. By them requesting it, if it will be granted, that would actually emphasize the embarrassment and emphasize the disgrace. And they are, being that they're communal leaders, they put the needs of the people before their own needs and before their own desires. Right.
I have another question.
Sure.
Yeah, I did. I just did.
Because you keep saying the 38th year, but I thought that it was 42 years that they got out from Egypt before they got into Israel.
They were 40 years, I think. Maybe until they settled, until they conquered, until they took over the land.
Yeah, until they crossed the Jordan River, I think it was 42 years.
Right, but they're wandering in the
I don't
desert.
know, but I remember
Was
the
40
42
years, including the first 2 years.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
it occurs to me, I don't know if there's been any writings on this. Maybe Ben Thiel might know, but it just occurs to me that maybe Hashem Kadosh Baruch Hu was emphasizing that the Korban Pesach, that the Passover sacrifice should be celebrated in Jerusalem because he wanted to make sure and emphasize to the people of Israel, to the Bnei Israel, that they should make Israel and especially Jerusalem central to the Jewish religion and not just be'ofen mefuzar all over the place. Anywhere they could do the same thing and have the same level of kedusha. I think maybe it occurs to me that he wanted to emphasize this, and maybe Moshe Rabbeinu sensed this and realized this.
That may be, that could be. The question would be why specifically this commandment? In other words, we know that idea from other places, so maybe this commandment they should be able to fulfill similar to the other sacrifices. But that definitely may be explanation. Back to the general idea of the second Passover, the fact that there were a group of people which were impure, and they came with the request, why should we miss out? And Hashem granted them their request. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, learned a very powerful lesson from this story. So I'm going to share the screen again. And yeah, the third source. The theme of the second Passover is that it is never too late. They were impure. They missed the first Passover. Someone was far. He was out of Jerusalem. He wasn't there for whatever reason. We say there's a second chance. So the theme is that it's never too late. it is always possible to set things right. Even if one was ritually impure or one was far away when it was gifted, that is the lesson that we learn from the second Passover. That a person could think, I have control over the present. I have control over the future, right? I could choose how to act in the future. What about the past? The past is lost. The past is gone. I missed Passover. I was far. Maybe it's because I slept in and missed the flight. I didn't make it on time. Maybe it's because I was impure, which on a spiritual level is that I did something wrong. So I could correct the future, but the past is lost. So we say, no, the lesson we have to learn is that we could correct the past also. The past is not lost. However, there's one condition. We have to be like those people that asked, why should we miss out? Based on what we spoke, there were two groups. There are two stories what happened. One was a small group of people that missed the first Passover, the first Passover, the beginning, what's on in the month of Nisan, and it bothered them. They asked Hashem, why should we miss out? And Hashem said, you know what? You won't have to miss out. I'll give you a chance to correct it and rectify what you missed. Then there's another group of people, the Jews of the 38 years wandering the desert, where they didn't ask, why should we miss out? And they didn't ask, and they didn't get it. It wasn't offered to them to correct the past. But when they asked, that's when the request was fulfilled. So we're learning here that that it's never too late. And we have a second chance. And we're able to correct the past. We're able to fix up a wrong that we did in the past. However, first, there has to be the request, the cry, why should I miss out? Meaning it bothers me and I want to fix the past. Then Hashem would give us the ability to fix the past, to actually fix the past. In 1982, the Rebbe, in a gathering, he's one time addressing the crowd, and he mentioned this idea of this thought of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, how the lesson of the second Passover is that it's never too late, and we always could fix it. But he added a small twist. He said, there's a large crowd of people sitting here. Some people, when they hear such a thing, it's speaking to everyone, to most people. It doesn't mean me in particular. So the first thing he said is that, first of all, anyone who hears this, it's a lesson for them. That's the first thing. You heard about it. You got to know this idea, this profound concept of that you're able to fix the past. So first of all, it's a lesson to you. And then he went on and said, and the reason, but however, you have to want to fix the past. You have to be like that group of people which requested, why should we miss out? Then, how could we actually fix the past? With what power do we have to fix the past? Let's say I did something wrong last year or many years ago. And now I want to fix it. I feel bad for what I did. I want to fix it. I want to correct my actions. The reason is because this idea that we spoke about in the past, that all those actions, all those not good actions, are external factors. There's something very deep in me, like we spoke in the past, there's the neshama, which is very deep and always connected to Hashem, which doesn't get disconnected based on my past actions. So since my past actions were only external and didn't tamper with my core connection to Hashem, therefore, as soon as I want to, and as soon as I request, why should I miss out? And I want to fix the past, then Hashem would grant us the ability and forgive us and let us fix the past, which is a very powerful lesson from this, what we learned from this week's parsha, this week's Torah portion. How we have the power, the ability to fix the past and to make up for actions that we missed and we didn't do in the past, if only we want to. So we have to learn from that small group of people who really, probably when they came to approach Moses, everyone looked at them like crazies. Who are you? You were exempt. You didn't have to keep it. So you lost your chance. Move on in life. Don't get stuck. So we say, no, not only you could fix the future, not only you could prepare yourself and fix your ways in the future, there's even a way to fix the past. Right? Is everything clear?
Rabbi, that was wonderful.
Thank
really
you.
Practical.
Yeah.
Great.
All right. So I think we'll stop here. Everyone have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very
Rabbi.
much, Rabbi Simon.